When you picture surviving a brutal winter on the frontier, you think about fuel, cutting more wood, stacking it higher, feeding the fire through the night. That picture is wrong, or rather, it is missing the thing that actually killed people. The fire was not the problem. Most families could make fire. What killed them was what happened between fires, the speed at which a room gave its heat back to the cold the moment the flames dropped. A fireplace did not just burn fuel, it pumped warm air out of the room and up the chimney, leaving nothing behind. One woman on the northern plains understood that the answer was not more fire. It was something that could hold what fire gave it and return it slowly through the dark, long after the flames went out. The wagon that brought Ragna to the edge of the claim did not wait for her to step down before the driver began turning the team. She stood in the frozen ruts with her brother's hand in hers and watched the bed pull away with the casual speed of someone leaving a thing already dead. Eli coughed into her coat sleeve. He was 12. His lungs had not been right since the scarlet fever, and the sound he made was wet and deep, the kind of sound that belonged in a sick room, not in open wind on a Dakota plain with no roof yet overhead. The property was not a homestead. It was what remained after a homestead failed. The blacksmith who had filed the claim had died 2 winters back. His house had burned in a chimney accident the same season, and what the fire left, the weather finished. Now there was a barn shell with 3 standing walls and a 4th that leaned like a man trying not to fall. There was a stone hearth built for a house kitchen that no longer existed, its chimney throat open to a sky the color of wet ash. And there was a ruined forge building 30 yards east, half collapsed, its roof beams canted at angles that made the whole structure look like it had been stepped on. Ragna had $27. She had 2 blankets, 1 trunk, a sack of oats, and rough flour enough for perhaps 3 weeks if she cut portions to what a grown woman and a sick boy could survive on without their hands shaking too badly to work. She had 1 milk cow, not yet calved, tied behind the wagon, and now standing in the frozen grass with the patience of an animal that did not understand what had happened. What had happened was simple. The merchant family in town had promised her kitchen work through the winter. She had traveled on that promise, spent passage money on that promise, fed her brother on that promise. Then a cousin of the merchant's wife arrived from St. Paul, and the position dissolved like frost on a window pane. No work, no wages, no room offered in its place. The merchant's wife had looked past Ragna when she delivered the news, as though the girl had already become invisible. There was no passage east. The railroad was too far, and $27 would not cover fare and lodging for 2, let alone a doctor for Eli's chest. There were no relatives within 500 miles. There was no charity that would keep them together. The Women's Aid would take Ragna for domestic labor, and Eli would go to a different household or an institution. And she had made a promise over her mother's grave that she would not let that happen. So she stood on the edge of a dead man's claim in eastern Dakota Territory in the autumn of 1887, and she looked at what she had. The barn leaked air at every board seam. She could feel it on her face even standing inside, thin currents running through gaps where the wood had warped and shrunk. The roof was patched with sod that had frozen and cracked. The floor was packed earth, hard as stone in places, soft and sour where animals had stood. In one corner, a pile of hay gone gray with age. In another, the great stone hearth, its firebox wide enough for a kitchen that had burned to nothing, its chimney drawing upward into cold sky. She had no stove. A stove was what you needed in a place like this, an enclosed iron box that held its fire tight and pushed heat outward through its walls. What she had instead was an open hearth, the kind that had warmed manor houses in centuries past, but that even frontier families understood was wasteful. An open fireplace did not just burn fuel, it devoured the room's own warmth. The draft pulled heated air upward through the throat and sent it into the sky, and what remained was a circle of warmth that barely reached past the hearthstones before the cold swallowed it. Eli sat on the trunk and watched her with eyes that were too old for his face. He did not ask what they would do. He had learned in the years since their father died and the months since their mother followed that asking did not produce answers. Only waiting did. Ragna counted the fuel. Along the barn's east wall, someone had stacked split wood at some point, perhaps the blacksmith, perhaps a neighbor clearing brush. It had been rained on, snowed on, and partly scavenged. What remained was perhaps a cord and a half of mixed hardwood and pine, much of it soft with rot. She pulled a piece free and pressed her thumbnail into the grain. It sank. She dropped the piece and tried another. Better. A third. Soft again. A cord and a half of mixed quality fuel against a Dakota winter. In a barn with no stove, no sealed walls, and a chimney that would drink warmth faster than she could make it. She did the arithmetic standing there in the cold, her breath making small clouds that the draft stole before they faded. To keep a fire burning around the clock in an open hearth inside a drafty shelter, she would need several cords at minimum, and that assumed mild cold. In the teeth of a plains blizzard, with wind driving the chimney draft until the flames flattened and spat, she might burn through a full cord in days. What she had would not last until Christmas. Christmas was still months away. The killing cold came in January. The man came on the third day. Harlan Voss was 58, built like a post that had weathered but not weakened, with a gray mustache stained yellow at the corners and hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood as the wagon seat he sat on. He had been an army teamster before the frontier pulled him into settlement hauling, and he knew the northern plains the way a sailor knew open water, not with love, but with the respect that comes from having seen what it could do to people who did not take it seriously. He had delivered them. Now he came back, and Ragna understood from the way he climbed down that this was not a social visit. He was checking whether they were still alive. He walked the barn without asking permission. He tested the walls with his fist, pressing where the boards gaped. He looked up at the roof and shook his head at the cracked sod. He stood before the hearth and stared into the firebox the way a doctor might stare at a wound. Then he turned to Ragna. "You haven't got a room," Voss said. "You've got a sieve, no stove, no proper door. That hearth will eat your wood and give you a warm face and a frozen back, and on a hard plains night you'd need a close heater, a tight wall, and wood stacked high as a man. You've got none of those things." Ragna said nothing. Voss walked to the woodpile and pulled pieces the way she had, testing with his thumb. He counted under his breath. When he finished, he did not look at her with cruelty. He looked at her with the flat expression of a man delivering a verdict he wished were different. A cord and a half, and half of that is punky. You'd need 5-6 times this to burn through to March in a place this open, even with a stove, which you haven't got, even with tight walls, which you haven't got. He paused. "Where's the boy?" "Inside." "His lungs sound right?" "No." Voss pulled his hat off and held it against his leg. The wind moved his hair sideways. He was quiet long enough that Ragna thought he might simply walk back to his wagon. "I've hauled families out here for 15 years, he said. "Some made it. Some did not. The ones who did not, it wasn't always the cold that killed them first. It was not knowing what the cold could do, not understanding the arithmetic." He put the hat back on. "You understand the arithmetic. I can see that. And I'm telling you, the numbers don't work." "I know," Ragna said. "Then come to town. There's a women's boarding situation. The boy could—" "No." The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Voss studied her. She was 22 and looked older. Her coat was too thin. Her hands were already cracked at the knuckles. But her eyes did not waver, and he had hauled enough settlers to know the difference between stubbornness and something harder. "I can't make you leave," he said. "No." He climbed back onto his wagon. Before he released the brake, he said, without turning, "If you change your mind, the road is the road. Don't wait until the snow makes it impossible." She watched him go. The wind filled the silence he left behind. That night she built the first fire in the hearth. The wood caught well enough. The flames climbed. For 10 minutes, she could feel warmth on her face and chest, and Eli stopped coughing long enough to hold his hands toward the light. Then the draft found its rhythm. She could feel it, not see it, feel it, the way the air moved past her, drawn from behind, pulled through the gaps in the walls, sucked into the fire's hunger, and sent roaring upward through the throat of the chimney. The fire was not warming the room. The fire was stealing the room's warmth and sending it into the sky. By midnight, the barn was colder than it had been before she lit the fire. She understood the physics even if she could not have named them. The hearth was a pump. It pulled cold air in through every crack, heated it briefly in the flame, and evacuated it upward. The faster the fire burned, the harder the pump worked. She was not heating a room. She was ventilating it. She fed the fire anyway because the alternative was no fire at all. She sat between Eli and the hearth and held the blankets tight and listened to his breathing and counted the wood she had already burned. 7 pieces, perhaps a fifth of a cord's worth, spent in one night, and the room was barely warmer than the outside. The arithmetic was worse than Voss had said. The forge ruin changed everything, though it did not feel like a revelation at the time. It felt like labor. On the 5th day, Ragna walked to the collapsed smithy because she needed anything: nails, wire, a hinge, metal she could trade for food. The building leaned away from the wind like a drunk leaning on a wall. Half the roof had fallen inward. Snow covered the wreckage in a white sheet that hid whatever lay beneath. She pulled boards aside. She kicked through frozen rubble. And under the mess of it, she found what the blacksmith had left behind: 4 anvils. They sat on the ruined floor like monuments. The largest was enormous, 200 pounds or more of solid iron, its horn chipped, its face scarred with 1,000 hammer strikes, its base planted on a section of oak stump that had survived the collapse. The second was smaller, but still heavy enough that she could not shift it with one hand. The third and fourth were bench anvils, lighter, one cracked along the heel but still whole. Around them lay the debris of a working forge: wagon skeins, broken plowshares, iron cutoffs, horseshoes in a rusted tangle, solid blocks that had served as swags and supports, iron everywhere, abandoned because it was too heavy to steal without a wagon and too common to justify the effort. Ragna stood among the wreckage and felt the wind move through the gaps in the ruined walls. She did not yet understand what she was looking at. She picked up a horseshoe and turned it in her hand. The iron was cold, heavy, inert. She set it down and moved on to search for nails. That evening, the second thing happened. Eli wandered to the forge ruin while she split wood. When she found him, he was sitting on the ground near a pile of rubble where she had built a small clearing fire to thaw a water bucket. His hands hovered near a flat iron block she had uncovered. "This one's warm," he said. "I know, it was near the fire. But the wood next to it isn't." She stopped. The observation was simple, a child's observation. The fire had gone out an hour ago. The plank beside the iron block was already cold to the touch. But the iron still held warmth, faint, fading, but present. Her fingers confirmed it. The metal radiated heat, the wood did not. And then, standing in the ruined forge with her brother's words hanging in the frozen air, she heard her father's voice. Not memory in the way poets meant it, not some ghostly whisper, just the plain recollection of a specific moment in a specific place. Their father's repair shop in the Minnesota settlement, winter, when she was 9. The stove had burned low. Her father had taken her hand and moved it from the open air to the side of a thick iron plate that sat against the stove wall. "Feel that," he had said. "The fire's been down an hour. The air's cold already. But the iron remembers." He had moved her fingers along the plate's surface, letting her feel how the stored warmth traveled, not blazing, not dramatic, but steady and real. Then he had moved her hand to a wooden plank at the same distance from the stove. Cold. The wood had given up its heat the moment the fire dropped. The iron had not. Flame is quick, her father had said. Iron remembers. She had filed the lesson the way children file things adults say, without understanding, without weight. Now, standing in a dead blacksmith's ruined shop with 4 anvils and 100 pounds of scrap iron at her feet, the lesson returned with a force that made her close her eyes. The fire was not the problem. The fire was fine. The problem was that the fire's heat had nowhere to go except up the chimney and out through the walls. The room could not hold what the fire gave it. The air was too thin, too quick to move, too easily stolen by the draft. But iron was not air. Iron was dense. Iron absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. Iron did not care about the draft. Iron sat where you put it and radiated what it had absorbed, hour after hour, like a stone that had baked in summer sun and stayed warm into the evening. What if the fire's job was not to heat the room directly? What if the fire's job was to heat iron, as much iron as she could place in and around the flame, and then let the iron heat the room? The idea was not elegant. It was not an invention. It was an observation married to desperation, the kind of thinking that happened when the arithmetic was impossible, and the only variable left to change was how heat moved through a space. She went back to the barn and drew on a board with charcoal, a semicircle of iron arranged inside the hearth mouth. The largest anvils closest to the coal bed, their heels outward, their horns angled inward to catch flame on more surface. Smaller blocks stacked between them to close the gaps where air would otherwise flow freely. A rear layer of iron against the stone back wall to soak up reflected heat and throw it forward. The fuel burned hot and concentrated, not spread thin across the wide firebox. She was not building a stove. She was turning the hearth into a crude thermal battery, a mass of iron that would charge while the fire burned hard and then continue releasing heat when the fire dropped, when the wind surged, when she slept. The risk was real. If she was wrong, she would waste labor she could not afford and burn through fuel faster by concentrating the fire without gaining stored heat. She might crack the hearthstones with uneven thermal stress. She might injure herself hauling iron that outweighed her. She might lose days she needed for other survival tasks, sealing walls, gathering food, cutting more wood. If she was right, she bought hours. Hours when the wind could howl and the chimney could pull and the fire could falter and the room would still hold enough warmth for a sick boy to breathe through the night. Marta Kelsey came the next morning. She was the nearest settler woman, 34, sharp-featured, overworked, with 4 children of her own, and a husband who drove freight and was gone more than he was home. She brought a jar of pickled beets, and a hard look that said the beets were charity she could not afford, and the look was her honest opinion. Ragna was in the forge ruin, trying to rock the second anvil off its stump. Marta watched from the doorway, arms crossed, steam rising from her mouth in the morning cold. "I heard what you're doing," Marta said. Ragna braced her shoulder against the anvil's waist and pushed. It did not move. "Iron belongs under a hammer or on a wheel," Marta said. "You put it in a fire and all you've done is heat iron. It won't keep a child through the night." "It holds heat," Ragna said, still pushing. "Longer than air, longer than wood, longer than stone." "So does a hot brick. You don't see me stacking bricks in my firebox. You have a stove." "I have a stove that leaks at every seam and a husband who cuts wood when he's home, which is never." Marta's voice softened a fraction. "I'm not mocking you. I'm telling you what I know.
You'd be wiser to come in with one of the families and work for your board. The Andersons would take you. Eli could. Eli stays with me. Then you need a stove, not a pile of scrap. I don't have a stove. I have 4 anvils and 100 pounds of iron and a hearth that steals every piece of heat I make. Ragna stopped pushing.
Her shoulder burned. If the iron holds what the fire gives it, even for a few hours past the flames, that might be enough. Not comfortable. Enough. Marta stared at her. Then she set the beets on a beam and walked away. At the edge of the clearing, she turned back. If it doesn't work, she said, come to me before the boy gets worse. Don't let pride freeze him. She left. The jar of beets sat on the beam, and the cold crept back in through every gap. The mockery started before Ragna had moved the first anvil. 2 cowboys riding the fence road saw her dragging iron on a plank sled toward the barn. One pulled up and watched with his hat pushed back and his mouth open in the grin of a man seeing something he planned to describe at the next card table. The other did not even stop. He laughed from the saddle, a short bark that carried across the frozen grass. She's forging ghosts, the first one said. Building herself a throne, the other called back. A third voice, from a freight wagon passing later. Girl thinks winter can be scared off with scrap. The words traveled. On the frontier, words always traveled. Within a week, the woman trying to heat a barn with rusted anvils was a joke repeated at the supply post, at the roadhouse, at the livery where men waited for their horses and told each other stories about the foolish things people did when they were desperate. Ragna heard some of it. She heard enough. The laughter did not land the way the laughers intended because she was too tired and too afraid for embarrassment to find purchase. But the isolation did. On the frontier, reputation decided who extended credit, who offered day labor, who warned you when weather was coming, who stopped to check if you were alive. A woman marked as foolish was a woman who would not be helped. Then Silas Creel arrived. Creel was 41, the roadhouse keeper and salvage dealer who operated a way station 6 miles west. He was lean, careful with money, and possessed the particular intelligence of a man who understood that other people's failures were his inventory. He had been waiting for spring to claim the abandoned smithy iron through local influence and the dead man's unpaid debts. The anvils, the scrap, the horseshoes. He had already counted them in his ledger. Now a girl was dragging his future merchandise into a fireplace. He came while Ragna and Eli were levering the first large anvil over a skid pole she had cut from a fallen cottonwood. The anvil sat on the pole like a boulder on a branch, and both of them strained against the pry bar she had wedged under its base. Eli's face was red. His breathing was audible from 20 feet. Creel dismounted and stood with his hands in his coat pockets and watched them the way a man watches children trying to lift a stone too heavy for them. That's shop iron, he said. Forest anvils. They've been claimed against his debts. Nobody claimed them, Ragna said, not stopping. Nobody filed. I've got an understanding with the land office. An understanding isn't a filing. Creel's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. He had expected a girl. He had found an argument. You stacked that much iron in flame, he said, his voice steady, almost friendly. You'll crack the hearth and smoke yourselves dead before supper. Stone doesn't want iron pressed against it in a hot fire. It'll split. And when it splits, the chimney goes, and you've got a barn fire instead of a house fire, which is what killed the last man who tried to live here. Ragna straightened from the pry bar. Her shoulder throbbed. Her hands were raw from the cold iron. She looked at Creel and saw exactly what he was, a man who would profit from her departure. Then I'll learn before dark, she said. Creel laughed. It was a small laugh. the kind that carried no warmth. You'll learn. That's good. Learn fast. He looked at Eli, who was still breathing hard, still red in the face, still gripping the pry bar like it was the only solid thing in his world. That boy needs a roof, not an experiment. He mounted and rode west. The sound of his horse faded into the wind. Before the week was out, Ragna learned what Creel's visit had cost her. The nearest woodcutter, a bohemian named Petrick, who sold split fuel from a stand of oak on his claim, told her that Creel had already purchased every cord Petrick could spare. Creel did not need the wood. His roadhouse burned coal shipped from the east. He had bought it to make sure Ragna could not. The move was quiet, efficient, and devastating. Without additional fuel, the arithmetic she had already calculated became worse. What she had would not last, and the one nearby source that might have extended her supply was now locked behind a man who wanted her gone. Ragna looked at Eli. Eli looked at the anvil. "He's scared of you," Eli said. "He's scared of losing the iron." Same thing. She almost smiled. Almost. Then she braced the pry bar again. Construction began in earnest the next morning, and it nearly ended that same afternoon. The first anvil, the great one, the 200-pound monument with its scarred face and chipped horn, had to travel 30 yards from the forge ruin to the barn hearth. Ragna could not lift it. She could not carry it. She could barely tilt it on its stump base. But she had watched men move heavy things her whole life, and she knew that weight was only an obstacle if you fought it directly. She cut 3 hardwood rods from the cottonwood stand, each as thick as her forearm. She laid them parallel on the frozen ground, spacing them a foot apart. Then she tipped the anvil off its stump, a controlled fall that shook the earth and nearly caught her boot, and onto the first rod. Rolling. The anvil rolled on the rods the way a barrel rolls on a deck, slow, uneven, requiring constant correction as the unequal weight of the horn tried to steer it sideways. But it moved. She walked beside it, kicking the rear rod forward to the front as the anvil passed over it, keeping 3 rods always beneath the iron. 30 yards. It took her 2 hours. Her arms shook by the end. Her lower back felt like it had been beaten with a plank, but the anvil sat on the barn floor in front of the hearth, squat and dark and impossibly heavy, and it was where she needed it. The second anvil came the next day. Smaller, lighter, but the ground had thawed in patches and the rods sank into mud, and she spent an hour cribbing the path with flat boards before the rolling would work. Then the skid pole snapped. She was levering the third anvil, one of the bench pieces, over a rise in the ground when the cottonwood pole broke cleanly at a knot she had not seen. The anvil dropped 6 inches. The broken end of the pole whipped sideways and struck the ground a hand's width from Eli's foot. Eli did not scream. He stepped back and stared at the place where the pole had hit, and then he looked at Ragna, and his face was white. She made him sit down. She checked his foot, his ankle, his leg. Nothing touched. But her hands were shaking, and not from the cold. If the pole had struck him, 80 pounds of iron dropping onto a 12-year-old boy's foot in country with no doctor within a day's ride, the experiment would have ended in a way that made the skeptics right about everything. She sat in the frozen grass beside him and pressed her palms against her eyes and breathed until the shaking stopped. Then she stood, cut a new pole from a thicker section, and finished the job. By the end of the 5th day, 3 anvils and most of the loose iron sat inside the barn. The semicircle was taking shape, the great anvil centered in the hearth mouth, the second flanking it, smaller blocks filling gaps. Flat plowshares leaned against the sides as reflectors. She packed sand and broken brick beneath the base pieces to protect the hearthstones from direct contact, building up a foundation layer piece by piece.
tamping it with a flat board until it was solid enough to trust. Her hands told the story of the work. The right palm was split along the heel, where the pry bar had bitten through her glove. The left thumbnail was black and loose, crushed between the second anvil and a crib block on the third day. Her shoulder, bruised black from a pry bar kickback when the cottonwood fulcrum shifted, ached with every movement above her chest. She ate half portions to save daylight for hauling, and by evening her hands trembled when she tried to cut bread. Eli helped where he could. He carried the smaller pieces, horseshoes, cut-offs, flat iron scraps, in a wooden bucket, making slow trips between the forge ruin and the barn. Each trip ended with a coughing fit that doubled him over. Ragna watched from the corner of her eye and counted the trips against the sound of his breathing and tried to decide which would kill him first, the labor or the cold, if the labor stopped. The arrangement was rough, unbalanced, improvised. It looked like what it was, a desperate woman's best guess at physics she understood in her hands but could not explain in words. On the 6th day, she lit the first real test fire with the partial mass in place. She built it hot and tight, concentrated against the back of the great anvil, feeding it steadily for 2 hours until the iron was warm to the touch from 6 inches away. Then she let the fire drop to coals and waited. The result was not triumph. It was a whisper. An hour after the visible flames collapsed, the air near the anvils was still warmer than the air at the barn door. Not warm, not comfortable, but present. A difference she could feel with her open palm. The iron was doing something the air alone could not. It was holding heat past the moment the fire gave it, releasing it slowly into the bitter space of the barn. It was not enough. Not yet. Not with only 3 anvils and half the scrap in place, and gaps between the masses where the draft still flowed freely upward. But it was proof that the idea was not madness. It was proof that iron remembered. The weather was changing. She could feel it the way plains people learn to feel it, not in the temperature, which had been cold all along, but in the quality of the air. A stillness was building. The wind had dropped to nothing for 2 days running, and the sky had taken on a flat, featureless white that pressed down like a lid. Voss had told her once, during the wagon ride out, that the quiet before a plain storm was the most dangerous weather of all. Not because of what it did, but because of what it promised. She had perhaps a week, perhaps less. The iron was in place, but not tested. The hearth had not been fired with the full mass loaded. She did not know if the stones would hold. She did not know if the arrangement would trap heat or merely redistribute it. She did not know anything except that the old way burn wood, lose heat, burn more wood, was a mathematics of certain failure. And somewhere east of the barn, in a ruin she had already stripped of everything movable, the 4th anvil still sat on its stump. The cracked one. The one she had left because it was damaged, and because she was too exhausted to face another 2-hour crawl across frozen ground. She looked at the sky. She looked at the hearth, half-loaded, untested. She looked at Eli, asleep on the trunk, with both blankets pulled to his chin, his breathing a ragged whistle that rose and fell with the rhythm of lungs that could not afford another night of cold. If you have ever been told that what you were building was foolish by someone who did not understand what you were fighting, tell us about it in the comments. Because this story is only beginning. Tomorrow Aslak Brekka would come, a man she had not met, a wheelwright and retired smith with a bad leg, and a lifetime of knowledge about how metal held and released heat. He would come because he heard in town that some fool girl was hauling anvils into a chimney. He would come to laugh. He would not leave laughing. But tonight, in the barn, with the wind beginning to stir again and the first hard stars appearing through the gap in the roof, tonight Ragna was alone with her brother and her iron and the slow, terrible arithmetic of a winter that had not yet shown its teeth.
The great anvil sat in the hearth mouth, cold, dark, waiting for fire. She had 6 days, maybe 7, before the sky fell. The iron remembered nothing yet. Aslak Bricka arrived on the 7th day, and he did not arrive quietly. Ragna heard the wagon before she saw it, a slow, uneven creak that meant a bad axle or a careful driver or both. She was inside the barn, on her knees, packing clay into the gaps between the wallboards near the sleeping corner. Her fingers were raw with it, the cold clay stiffening under her nails, and she did not stop when the creaking stopped outside. The man who appeared in the doorway was 66 years old, with a left leg that swung stiff from the hip and a face carved by decades of wind into something that looked less like skin and more like tanned leather stretched over hard wood. He wore a coat patched at both elbows, a hat that had seen better decades, and the expression of a man who had driven 12 miles in cold weather to confirm a piece of gossip. He stood in the doorway and looked at the hearth. Then he looked at Ragna. Then he looked back at the hearth. The semicircle of iron sat in the firebox like something from a fever dream. The great anvil anchored the center, its face aimed toward the coal bed, its horn jutting forward. The second anvil flanked it. Iron blocks, plowshares, and scrap filled the gaps between them. The arrangement was crude, asymmetrical, and to anyone who had spent a lifetime working iron, it was immediately recognizable as something more than junk piled in a fireplace. Aslak limped inside. He did not introduce himself. He walked to the hearth and crouched slowly, his bad leg extending to the side, and studied the placement of the masses. He reached out and tapped the great anvil's heel with 2 fingers, the way a man might tap a wall to test whether it was hollow. "Who told you to do this?" he said. "Nobody." "Your father was a smith." It was not a question. Ragna stood and wiped her clay-caked hands on her skirt. "A repair smith and boiler hand. He died last year." "What did he teach you about iron?" "That it holds what fire gives it longer than flame alone." Aslak was quiet for a long time. He studied the arrangement the way she had seen her father study a piece of broken machinery, not looking at the whole, but following the logic of each part, tracing the intention behind the placement. His eyes moved from the coal bed to the nearest anvil face, to the gap between the first and second mass, to the plowshares propped against the sides, to the sand and brick base she had tamped beneath the heaviest pieces. "The throat is too open," he said finally. "You've narrowed the firebox, which is right, but the heat is still climbing free above the iron. You need something at the top to slow the pull. Not seal it, and you'll smoke the room. Slow it. Push the heat sideways before it goes up." Ragna stared at him. "Who are you?" "Aslak Bricka, wheelwright. Used to shoe horses and mend axles before this leg quit on me." He straightened, wincing. "I came 12 miles because I heard some fool girl was hauling anvils into a chimney. I came to see what kind of fool." "And?" He looked at her with eyes that were not laughing. "The anvils are right. The placement is wrong. You've got the thinking, but not the craft. If you'll let me, I'll show you where the heat goes." He stayed 3 days that first visit, sleeping in his wagon, eating what she shared, working beside her with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent 40 years understanding how metal and fire behave together. The first thing he taught her was how to move weight without destroying her body. She had been muscling the iron with brute effort, shoving, dragging, prying with raw leverage. Aslak watched her strain against the 4th anvil, the cracked bench piece she had left in the forge ruin, and then he held up one hand. "Stop. You'll split your back and be no use to anyone." He showed her the fulcrum method. A long pry bar. He had a proper one in his wagon, forged steel, 5 feet long, set against a fulcrum stone positioned close to the load. The closer the fulcrum to the weight, the less force required at the other end.
She could move the cracked anvil with one arm if the geometry was right. Iron doesn't care how strong you are, he said. It cares where you put the lever. He showed her how to crib with stacked blocks, building a staircase of short lifts instead of one impossible heave. How to roll on hardwood rods with the load centered, not leading with the heavy end. How to use her legs and hips instead of her shoulders and arms, keeping her spine straight, letting the strongest muscles do the hardest work. By afternoon, she had moved the fourth anvil to the barn in 40 minutes. It had taken her 2 hours to move the first. The second thing he taught her was where heat actually went. Aslak built a small fire in the hearth, not the roaring blaze she had been making, but a tight, controlled burn concentrated against the back of the great anvil. He made her kneel beside him and hold her hand at different positions around the iron mass. "Here," he said, moving her palm to the side of the anvil, 6 inches from the surface. "Feel that. Warmth. Faint, but steady. Now here." He moved her hand above the iron into the space between the top of the semicircle and the chimney throat. Heat poured upward past her fingers like an invisible river. The draft was pulling it straight up and out. Everything the fire gave to the air above the iron was stolen within seconds. "You see it now," Aslak said. "You've got the mass right. But the mass only helps the room if the heat comes off the iron sideways, toward where the boy sleeps. Right now, half of it is going up the throat before it can do any good." He had her find a flat piece of sheet iron among the salvage, a section of old stovepipe, hammered open. He bent it over his knee, working it with a mallet until it curved into a shallow hood. Then he hung it from a bar wedged across the chimney throat, positioned above the iron semicircle like a low ceiling over the fire. "It's a baffle," he said, "not a damper. A damper seals the throat. This just makes the heat think twice before it leaves. It bounces off the bottom of the iron and comes back into the room." He lit the fire again. Same fuel, same iron, but now, with the baffle deflecting the rising heat back down toward the masses, the warmth at the sleeping corner was noticeable within an hour. Not dramatic, not a stove's tight, certain warmth, but present in a way it had not been before. Eli, sitting on the trunk with a blanket over his shoulders, said, "I can feel it from here." Aslak nodded. "That's the iron talking, not the fire. The fire's already going up the chimney, but the iron caught some of it first, and now it's giving it back." The third teaching came on the second day. Aslak had Ragna bank the fire to coals in mid-afternoon and then wait. He made her sit with her eyes closed and her hands extended toward the iron, feeling the heat change over time. "Stop watching the flames," he said. "Flames lie. They make you think you're warm because your eyes see the light, but the light isn't heat. The coals are heat, and the iron is heat after the coals die." He paused. "Watch the color of the metal in the dim. When the iron shows nothing, it's still warm. When the iron shows a dull red at the face, it's been charged deep. That color means hours, not minutes. Hours." She opened her eyes. The coal bed glowed orange. The face of the great anvil, in the dim light of the barn, showed nothing, but her hands, held 6 inches from the surface, felt the slow pulse of stored heat radiating outward. "How long will it hold?" she asked. "Depends on the mass. Depends on the wind. Depends on how well you've packed those walls." He looked at the gaps she had been filling with clay. "You need to shrink the room, not the barn, just the space you're trying to keep warm. Hang blankets, build a partition, heat a box, not a cathedral." That afternoon, they hung horse blankets from a rope stretched across the barn, creating a rough partition that enclosed the sleeping corner and the hearth in a space perhaps 10 by 12 feet. The rest of the barn, the cows' area, the storage, the open floor, was abandoned to the cold. What mattered was the box.
Aslak tested the clay patches and shook his head. You've got the right idea, but the wrong material. Clay shrinks when it dries. In 2 weeks, every patch will have pulled away from the wood, and you'll have gaps again. He showed her how to mix clay with chopped straw and animal hair. She cut handfuls from the cow's winter coat to create a filler that held its shape as it dried. They repacked every gap in the sleeping corner wall, pressing the mixture deep with their thumbs. By the 3rd day, the box was tight, the baffle was hung, and the full iron mass, 4 anvils, scrap blocks, plowshares, horseshoe bundles, sat in and around the hearth like a dark iron altar. Aslak stood back and looked at it. Ragna stood beside him. Eli sat on the trunk, wrapped in blankets, watching them both. You'll need to burn hard for a full hour to charge the deep mass, Aslak said. Not tall flames, concentrated heat. Keep the fuel against the iron, not spread across the firebox. When the fire drops to coals, the iron takes over. On a still night with the box closed, you might get 3 hours of livable warmth from the iron alone. And on a wind night? He did not answer immediately. The silence was its own kind of honesty. On a wind night, the chimney pulls harder, the fire burns faster, the heat escapes faster. You'll need to fire and charge in cycles, burn hard, let it soak, fire again. You won't sleep through it. I don't sleep through it now. He looked at her. She looked back. Between them, the understanding that passed was not warmth or sentiment. It was the recognition of one craft mind by another. She was not his student. She was a person who had arrived at the right idea through desperation and inheritance, and he was a person who could help her build it correctly. I'll come back in a week, he said. There's more to show you. The spacing is wrong between the 2nd and 3rd masses. You want a gap there for air to circulate and carry the heat outward, not a solid wall that keeps it trapped against the stone. And the plowshares should angle forward, not lean flat. You want them to throw heat into the room, not reflect it back into the iron. He climbed into his wagon. His bad leg made the step difficult, and he did not refuse when Eli held the wheel spoke steady for him. Watch where the heat goes, Aslak said. That's the whole lesson. Everything else is details. He drove off into a sky that had turned the color of old pewter. Ragna watched until the wagon disappeared into the gray line where the plain met the cloud shelf. Then she went inside and began rearranging the plowshares. The days between Aslak's visits were construction and fear in equal measure. Ragna adjusted the spacing as he had described. She angled the plowshares forward. She moved the 3rd anvil a hand's width away from the 2nd, creating an air channel that let warmth circulate outward instead of trapping it against the stone. Each adjustment was small. Each one changed the way the heat moved through the box. She fired the system every night and measured the results the only way she could, with her body. She held her hands at the sleeping corner and timed how long the warmth lasted after the flames dropped. The first night, with the full mass and the baffle in place, warmth lasted nearly 2 hours past the last visible flame. The second night, with the spacing adjusted, closer to 2.5. These were not triumphs. They were arithmetic. 2.5 hours meant she could sleep in short stretches, firing between them. It meant Eli could breathe warm air long enough for his lungs to rest. It meant the difference between endurance and slow, certain freezing. But 2.5 hours was not a blizzard. A blizzard was not a still, cold night. A blizzard was wind that drove the chimney draft until the flames bent sideways and the fire consumed fuel at 3 times the normal rate. A blizzard was cold that pressed against every gap in the walls with the patience of water finding its way through stone. A blizzard lasted 12 hours, sometimes 24, sometimes more. The wood supply was shrinking. She counted it every morning.
The daily burn, even with the iron mass reducing the total hours of active fire, was eating through the pile. She had perhaps 2 weeks of fuel. If the blizzard came early, she had less. Voss returned on the 9th day, unannounced. He walked the barn again, slower this time, and stood before the iron hearth with his arms folded and his face unreadable. He touched the side of the great anvil. It was between firings, cool but not cold, the residual warmth of the morning charge still faintly present. "Warm iron," he said. "Warm iron," Ragna confirmed. "In a barn. In a box." She pulled the blanket partition aside to show him the sealed sleeping corner. "I'm not heating the barn. I'm heating the corner the boy sleeps in." Voss studied the arrangement. He was quiet for a long time.
"It's clever," he said. "Improved, maybe. But improved is not the same as safe. A hard plains night, the kind that kills cattle standing up, I've seen that kind drop temperatures 30 degrees in an hour. The wind doesn't knock. It comes through every gap you didn't find." He looked at her. "You've done good work, better than I expected, but I told you the arithmetic doesn't work, and I still believe that. I know what you believe. I'm not trying to be cruel. I know that too." He left without saying more, but at the gate, a gap in the broken fence that served as the property's edge, he turned back. "If it gets bad," he said, "if you hear the freight bell ringing at the roadhouse, that's Creel's storm signal. It means the line drivers have pulled in and the road is closed. When you hear that bell, you have maybe 4 hours before the worst of it." She nodded. 4 hours, he repeated. Then he was gone. Aslak returned as promised. He brought with him a bucket of coal, not a fortune, but enough for 3 or 4 hard firings and a piece of knowledge that changed the system. He had Ragna build the hottest fire the hearth could hold. They fed it for an hour, concentrated against the iron, until the great anvil's face showed a faint, dull color in the dim light of the barn. Not red, not orange, but the ghost of warmth made visible. The heat in the box was fierce. Eli retreated to the far side of the partition. Then Aslak made her stop feeding the fire entirely. "Now we wait," he said. They sat in the box and felt the heat change. The flames died. The coals collapsed. The visible fire was gone within 20 minutes, but the iron kept pouring warmth into the space, not blazing, not dramatic, but steady, like a heartbeat. An hour passed. The box was cooler, but livable. 2 hours, still livable. The great anvil was warm to the touch, but no longer hot. "Oh, 3 hours, Aslak said. "Maybe 4 on a still night. That's your margin. That's what the iron buys you, time between fires. Time to sleep. Time for the boy's lungs to rest." He looked at her across the fading glow of the coal bed. His face was serious in a way that went past the technical. "But you need to understand something. This system doesn't save you. It gives you a chance. The difference between those two things is the difference between living and dying out here. I know the difference." "I think you do." He paused. "Your father taught you well." It was the first time he had acknowledged her father directly. Ragna felt something tighten in her chest. Not grief, not exactly, but the pressure of an inheritance she had not asked for pressing against the inside of her ribs. "He taught me that iron remembers," she said. He was right, but iron forgets too, given enough cold and enough time. Don't let the system make you overconfident. Fire early, fire often, and when the wind comes, fire like your life depends on it, because it does. He left the next morning. She watched him go with the same feeling she had watched the first wagon leave, the feeling of a door closing, of being alone again with her brother and her iron and the terrible weight of a winter that had not yet arrived.
The calm before the storm lasted 3 more days. On the first day, Marta came. She brought 2 sacks of coal cinders, partially spent, but with enough heat left to supplement the wood, and a kettle lid she said could serve as a secondary draft check near the base of the chimney. She still did not believe the method would work, but she stood in the box and felt the residual warmth from the morning firing, and her face changed in a way she could not hide. "It's warmer than my kitchen threshold," she said, "and your fire's been out an hour." "The iron holds it." Marta touched the side of the second anvil. She pulled her hand back, not because it burned, but because the warmth surprised her. She looked at Ragna with an expression that was half doubt, half something closer to fear. "If it holds through a hard night," Marta said, "you'll have done something nobody around here has thought to do." "It's not invention, it's iron." "Same thing, out here." She left the kettle lid and the coal cinders and walked home through the gray afternoon. At the edge of the clearing, she stopped, as she had the first time, and turned back. "I've got my children in my house," she said. "If this works, if it really works, I need to know how." On the second day, the sky changed.
The flat white ceiling that had pressed down for a week broke apart and reformed into something lower, darker, more textured, a cloud shelf that looked bruised, purple-black along its leading edge, moving from the northwest with the slow certainty of something that could not be stopped. On the third day, the wind died, not diminished, not calmed, died. The air went still with a completeness that felt wrong, as if the plane itself were holding its breath. The cow stood motionless in her corner, facing the wall. Birds that had been picking at the frozen grass disappeared. The silence was so total that Ragna could hear Eli's breathing from across the barn. She had seen this once before, as a child in Minnesota. The stillness before the hammer fell. She began firing the iron mass at noon, hours ahead of schedule. She burned hard and concentrated, driving heat into the metal with everything she had. She dragged in the last of the rotten wood and broke it across her knee and fed it to the fire. She used Marta's coal cinders, banking them against the base of the great anvil where they would burn slow and hot. She packed every remaining gap in the sleeping corner walls with the straw and hair clay mixture, pressing it in with fingers that shook, not from cold, but from the knowledge of what was coming. By late afternoon, the iron was as charged as she could make it. The great anvil radiated heat like a dark sun. The smaller masses glowed with stored warmth. The box was almost too hot, and she opened the partition briefly to let the excess bleed into the barn. Then she heard the bell. Creel's roadhouse was 6 miles west, but the freight bell was iron, and the still air carried sound across the plain like a voice across still water. It rang 3 times, slow and heavy. Storm signal. The line drivers were pulling in. The road was closed. 4 hours, Voss had said. Ragna looked at the sky. The bruised cloud shelf had swallowed the western horizon. The first wind came, not a gust, but a breath, cold and sharp, carrying the smell of snow that had not yet fallen. She pulled the partition closed. She checked the fuel. She checked the iron. She checked Eli. He was on the sleeping pallet, wrapped in both blankets, his face flushed and his eyes bright in a way that had nothing to do with firelight. She put her hand on his forehead. Hot. The fever had come back, the deep, wet heat of lungs fighting an infection they did not have the strength to win. "Eli, I'm all right." "You're not." "I know, but I'm all right." She knelt beside him and pulled the blankets tighter. Outside, the first wind sharpened. She could hear it finding the gaps she had missed, thin whistles along the roofline, a low moan where the barn's fourth wall leaned against its supports. The fire burned,
The iron soaked it in, and the sky fell. The blizzard came not as weather, but as violence. One moment the wind was a voice, the next it was a fist. It struck the barn broadside, and the whole structure groaned, timbers shifting, sod cracking on the roof, the leaning fourth wall shuddering against the braces she had wedged beneath it. Snow did not fall. Snow drove sideways, horizontal, hissing against the boards like sand thrown from a bucket. It found every gap the clay had missed and pushed through in thin white ribbons that dissolved into mist in the warmer air near the hearth. The chimney began to pull. Ragna felt it before she understood it, a surge in the draft, the fire leaning toward the throat as the wind outside created a pressure differential that turned the chimney into a pump. The flames stretched upward, thinned, flattened against the baffle. Sparks flew past the sheet iron hood and vanished into the dark above. The fire was being stolen, sucked upward and out by a force she could not fight directly. She fed it. She pushed more wood against the anvils, concentrating the fuel, trying to drive heat into the iron faster than the chimney could steal it. The wood burned fast, too fast, the draft consuming fuel at a rate that made her stomach clench. She was burning through her reserve. The arithmetic played in her head like a drum. 2 weeks of fuel at normal burn. But this was not normal burn. This was a chimney howling open-throated into a blizzard, and the fire was eating wood the way a river ate snow. The first hour passed. The box held. The iron mass radiated heat from its charged cores, supplementing the fire's direct warmth. Ragna could feel both sources, the sharp, immediate heat from the flames and the slower, steadier pulse from the iron surfaces. Together they kept the sleeping corner above freezing. Eli slept in short, ragged stretches, his breathing loud and wet. The second hour was worse. The wind found a new angle. It came down through the chimney itself, a downdraft that flattened the fire completely, shoving smoke and ash back into the room. Ragna's eyes burned. Eli coughed violently, a deep racking sound that shook his whole body. She grabbed the kettle lid Marta had left and held it against the base of the chimney throat, trying to deflect the downdraft, and the wind tore it from her hands and slammed it against the hearthstone. She adjusted the baffle, lowering it, narrowing the gap between the iron hood and the top of the fire. The downdraft eased, but the reduced opening meant less draft for the fire itself, and the flame shrank to a sullen glow barely larger than a lamp. This was the moment the iron had to work. The fire was barely alive. The chimney was fighting her. The wind was pulling heat from the room through every gap and seam. But the iron, 4 anvils, 20 blocks, a dozen plowshares and scrap pieces, all of it charged by hours of hard firing, continued to radiate. She could feel it on her face, on her hands, on the side of her body nearest the mass. Not hot, not comfortable, but warm, present. The iron was giving back what the fire had given it, slowly, steadily, in the way her father had shown her 30 years ago with a warmed horseshoe on a brick. The third hour. Eli's fever spiked. He threw off the blankets and Ragna pulled them back and he threw them off again and she held them against his chest with one hand while feeding the sulking fire with the other. The wind screamed through the roof gap. A section of sod peeled away from the rafters and fell into the barn on the far side of the partition, and cold air poured through the opening like water through a broken dam. She could not fix the roof. She could not leave Eli. She could not let the fire die. 3 things needed doing, and she had 2 hands and 1 body and no one else. She chose the fire. She chose it because without the fire, the iron could not recharge, and without recharging, the iron's stored heat would bleed away within hours, and the box would equalize with the outside air, and Eli would die. The roof gap was on the far side of the partition. She pulled the blanket wall tighter, sealing the box as best she could, and let the rest of the barn freeze. If you are invested in what happens next, hit subscribe and stay with us, because the longest hours of this night are still ahead. The 4th hour. One of the hanging blankets slipped its rope. It fell toward the fire. Ragna smelled singed wool before she saw it and lunged, grabbing the edge, pulling it back. Her hand closed on fabric that was already too hot, and she felt the burn register in the center of her palm, but she did not let go until the blanket was clear. Her hand throbbed. She wrapped it in a strip torn from the hem of her skirt and kept working. The 5th hour. She had been awake for 19 hours. The fire required constant attention, not skill, just presence. Feed it, adjust it, watch the draft, feel the iron. The repetition was its own kind of torment. Her body wanted to stop. Her mind wanted to stop. But the fire was the heartbeat, and if the heartbeat stopped, everything stopped. The 6th hour was the worst. The wind peaked. Later she would learn that the blizzard pushed temperatures across the region far below zero, with wind driving the effective cold to a place where exposed skin froze in minutes. She did not know the numbers. She knew the feeling that the cold was not outside the barn, but inside it, pressing against the partition, seeping through the blankets, reaching for Eli with fingers she could not see. She burned the fire as hard as she dared. The woodpile was down to the last quarter. She was rationing, trying to stretch it, but the chimney's hunger was insatiable. Every piece she fed to the fire was gone in minutes. Then the fire nearly died. She had misjudged the coals. Reached for a piece of wood and found her hand closing on rotten pine that crumbled instead of catching. The coal bed collapsed in on itself, and the flames dropped to almost nothing, a few blue tongues licking at the base of the great anvil, barely visible in the dark. For a span of time she could not measure, a minute, perhaps 2, the fire was functionally gone, and the iron held. She knelt in the dark with her burned hand and her exhausted body and felt the heat still coming, not from the flames, from the iron. The great anvil radiated warmth from its deep core, a stored reserve that the brief fire collapse could not touch. The smaller masses continued to pour their heat into the box. The temperature in the sleeping corner dropped. She felt it drop, but it did not crash. It eased like a slope instead of a cliff. She rebuilt the fire. She found solid wood, caught it on the remaining coals, nursed the flame back to life with her breath close to the coal bed, blowing steadily, carefully, the way Aslak had shown her, watching the coals, not the flames. The fire caught. The iron began to recharge, and the box stabilized. Somewhere in the 7th hour, exhaustion won. She sat down between Eli and the hearth with her back against the partition and her burned hand in her lap and her eyes open, watching the fire, watching the iron, watching the thin ribbons of snow that still pushed through the wall gaps and melted before they reached the floor. She slept. She did not decide to. Her body simply stopped asking permission. When she woke, the fire was coals. The visible flames were gone. The barn was darker than she had ever seen it, the kind of dark that meant the storm had buried whatever moonlight or starlight existed above the cloud. She could see nothing, but she could feel the iron. It was still warm. The great anvil pulsed heat into the dark like a living thing. The masses around it, charged by hours of concentrated firing, continued their slow release. The box was cold, colder than it had been, but not killing cold. Not the cold that stopped lungs and froze blood. Survivable cold. The kind of cold that hurt but did not end. Eli breathed. She heard it in the dark, the wet, labored sound of damaged lungs working too hard. But he breathed. His forehead,
when she touched it, was still hot with fever, but his skin was not cold. The iron had held the space above the line that separated sickness from death. She fed the fire again, slowly, carefully, with the last of the fuel she could reach without leaving the box. The flames came back. The iron began to drink again. Outside, the blizzard raged. But inside the box, in the dark, with the iron remembering what the fire had given it, the room held. Dawn came without sunrise. The sky lightened from black to dark gray to lighter gray, and the wind dropped from a scream to a moan to a steady push that still drove snow sideways, but no longer shook the walls. Ragna opened the partition and looked into the barn. Snow had drifted through the roof gap and covered the far floor in a white slope 2 feet deep. The cow stood in her corner, alive, her breath making small clouds, her eyes patient. The storm was not finished, but the killing hours had passed. She checked Eli. His fever had not broken, but it had not worsened. He was asleep, real sleep, not the restless tossing of the night, and his breathing, while still labored, was even. She checked the iron. The great anvil was cool to the touch on its outer face, but still warm at the base where it met the coal bed. The smaller masses had given up most of their stored heat. The system had done what she had built it to do, not perfectly, not comfortably, but enough. It had bridged the gap between fire and fire, between fuel and fuel, between the hours when she could tend the hearth and the hours when her body refused. She sat on the floor of the box with her back against the partition and her burned hand in her lap and looked at the iron semicircle in the gray light. It was ugly. It was crude. It was the work of a desperate woman and a lame wheelwright and a dead father's lesson about how metal held heat. It had no elegance and no beauty and no name, and it had kept them alive. Voss arrived at midday, driving his wagon through drifts that reached the axle hubs. He came through the barn door with snow in his mustache and the expression of a man who had expected to find a body. He stood in the box and felt the warmth still coming off the iron, faint now, hours past the last hard firing, but present. He put his hand near the side of the great anvil. He held it there for a long time. Down the road, another story had unfolded. A family 2 miles east, husband, wife, 3 children, had spent the night in a cabin with a failing stove and insufficient fuel. The stove's seam had cracked in the cold, and by the 3rd hour the heat was leaking out as fast as they could make it. By dawn, the youngest child could not stop shivering. The husband had carried the boy to the roadhouse at first light, walking through drifts in the dark, and Creel had let them in because even Creel would not turn away a man carrying a frozen child. They survived, but barely, and the difference between barely surviving and what Ragna had managed, the difference between a cracked stove bleeding heat and an iron mass storing it, was the difference the whole settlement would spend the rest of the winter trying to understand. Voss looked at Ragna. She looked back. Neither of them spoke for a moment that stretched long enough to hold the weight of everything that had happened. "I told you the arithmetic didn't work," Voss said quietly. "You were right, it didn't. But you changed the arithmetic. The iron changed it." He nodded. He pulled his hat off and held it against his leg, just as he had the first time he stood in this barn. The gesture was the same. The meaning was different. "I didn't know iron could stand in for part of what a winter needs," he said. "I know now." He put the hat back on and walked to the door. At the threshold, he stopped. "When the weather clears," he said, "people are going to come here. You'll want to be ready for that." He left. The wind pushed snow past the doorway in low, hissing waves. Inside the box, the iron ticked softly as it cooled, the same sound Ragna's father had made her listen to in his shop
a lifetime ago. The fire was nearly out. The iron was nearly spent. But the room remembered the warmth the way iron remembered flame, not forever, but long enough. Long enough. The visitors started 2 days after the storm broke. The first was a man Ragna did not know, a wheat farmer from 3 miles south named Peterson, thin-faced, quiet, with a wife and 2 daughters, and a cabin heated by an iron box stove that had cracked along its rear seam during the blizzard and leaked heat faster than he could feed it. He had heard about the woman with the anvils from Voss. He had not believed it. Now he stood in Ragna's barn, in the box, with his hand near the side of the great anvil, refired that morning, still radiating, and he did not speak for a long time. "How hot does it need to get?" he asked finally. "As hot as you can make it. Burn concentrated. Keep the fuel against the iron, not spread across the firebox." "For how long?" "An hour of hard firing charges the deep mass. After that, the iron gives back heat for 2, maybe 3 hours on a still night, less on a wind night, but even less is more than nothing." Peterson nodded. He looked at the plowshares angled forward, the scrap blocks filling the gaps, the baffle hanging in the chimney throat. He was a farmer, not a smith, but he understood the principle the way anyone who had ever picked up a sun-warmed stone in the evening understood it. Heat went in, heat came back out. The only question was how much mass and how long. "I've got iron," he said, "wheel rims, brake shoes, an old plow blade. Bring them close to the fire, as close as you can without blocking the coal bed. The more iron, the longer the hold." He left. That afternoon, his oldest daughter came back with a jar of preserved plums and a question about whether the iron needed to touch the fire directly or whether placement near the coals was sufficient. Ragna showed her with her hands, the same way her father had shown her, the same way Aslak had shown her. Here, where the heat comes off the surface. Here, where the draft steals it. Feel the difference. The girl was 15. She held her palm near the iron and her eyes widened, and Ragna saw something pass across her face that she recognized from the inside. The moment when an abstract idea became a physical truth. "Can I bring my sister?" the girl asked. "Bring anyone who wants to learn." The girl left with the plums forgotten on the hearth ledge. 2 days later, she returned with her younger sister and a neighbor's boy who carried a broken harrow tooth in his coat pocket and asked if it was enough iron to matter. Ragna told him anything mattered. A single piece of iron the size of a brick, placed against a hot stove, held heat for an hour past the fire's death. A dozen such pieces held it for 3. The point was not magic. The point was mass. Marta came the next day, and she did not come with doubt. She came with measurements. She had paced her kitchen. She had counted the iron she owned, a set of flat irons, 2 Dutch ovens, a broken griddle plate, a length of chain her husband used for hauling. She had a list written on the back of a flour sack, and she spread it on the trunk and looked at Ragna the way one woman looks at another when pride has been swallowed, and the question underneath is too important to decorate with pleasantry. "Show me," Marta said. Ragna showed her everything. The semicircle arrangement, the spacing between masses for air circulation, the baffle in its position, the bank and charge cycle, burn hard, let the iron soak, burn again, the partition that shrank the heated space, the clay and straw mix for sealing gaps. She showed it with her hands, crouching by the hearth, moving pieces, pointing to the places where heat moved and the places where heat escaped. Marta watched with the focused attention of a woman who had 4 children and a leaking stove and no margin for error. "The flat irons," Marta said. "Where do I put them?" "Against the stove, as close as you can get them to the hottest surface. Stack them if you have to. The more mass touching the hot iron, the more heat gets stored." "And the chain?" "Wrap it around the stovepipe. loosely. The pipe gets hot, the chain absorbs it and holds it. When the fire drops, the chain keeps radiating. Marta folded the flour sack and put it in her coat. She looked at the great anvil, squatting in the hearth mouth, dark and scarred and radiating the last of the morning's charge. "I called you foolish," she said. "You called the idea foolish. There's a difference." "Not enough of one." Marta paused. "My husband comes home in 3 weeks. When he sees the iron stacked around the stove, he'll think I've lost my mind." "Show him. Let him feel it." "I intend to, and if he gives me trouble, I'll send him here." She almost smiled. Ragna almost smiled back. The moment passed, and Marta walked home through the snow with her flour sack notes and her Dutch ovens already assigned positions in her mind. Not everyone converted. Creel heard about the visitors within a day. He heard about Marta's questions. He heard about Peterson's daughter learning to feel for iron warmth. And what he heard did not make him reconsider. It made him angry. He came to the roadhouse supply window where Ragna had gone to trade a jar of cream for salt, and he spoke loudly enough for 3 other men to hear. "The storm spared you, that's all. Storms spare people every year, and they don't go around pretending they invented a new way to heat a house." He leaned on the counter with both hands. "That iron will crack your hearth inside a month, and when it does, you'll burn that barn down, and then who pays for the damage? Not you. You've got nothing. You'll walk away and leave the mess for people who actually own property." Ragna set the cream jar on the counter. She looked at Creel. The 3 men at the window watched the exchange the way men watched any confrontation between a person with standing and a person without. "The hearth held through the storm," she said. "The iron held through the storm. The boy's alive. What cracks, I'll fix." "You'll fix. With what? Your $27? Your famous charm?" "With iron. Same as I fixed the heat." One of the men at the window, a farrier named Holm, who had spent his life around forges, looked at the floor. He did not laugh. The absence of his laughter was louder than Creel's words. Creel saw it. He saw the farrier's silence and the other men's uncertain eyes, and he understood, with the instinct of a man who traded on opinion, that the ground was shifting. He did not press the point. He took Ragna's cream jar without comment and measured out the salt and said nothing more. But as she left, he said to the room, not to her, "One storm doesn't make a winter. Wait for the next one." The words followed her home. Aslak returned when the roads cleared, and this time he brought tools, not gifts, loans, his own tongs, heavy and blackened from decades of forge work, a straight edge for checking alignment, a small hammer for testing iron density. He tapped pieces and listened to the ring, sorting good iron from flawed by sound alone. "This one," he said, tapping a block that sang high and clear. "Dense, uniform, it'll hold heat evenly. This one." He tapped another that gave a dull thud. "Has voids inside, uneven casting. It'll heat in spots and crack if you push it too hard." He was teaching her to read iron the way a horseman reads an animal, by attention, by habit, by the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 small observations. Ragna watched his hands and listened to the sounds and began to hear the differences herself. They worked together that week on refinements. Aslak showed her how to reposition the rear layer of scrap so it angled forward slightly, throwing radiant heat toward the sleeping area instead of absorbing it into the stone wall behind. He showed her how to build a secondary fire shelf, a flat plate of iron set on brick supports at the base of the hearth that caught falling coals and kept them burning against the lowest masses instead of dying in ash. "You're not building a forge," he said, when she stacked pieces too aggressively. "A forge concentrates heat in one spot. You're building a radiator. Spread the heat. Let it breathe."
You said concentrate the fire.
Concentrate the fire, spread the iron, two different things. He looked at her with the half-irritated, half-pleased expression of a craftsman watching a student arrive at the edge of understanding. The fire is the source. The iron is the distribution. If you concentrate both, you get a hot spot in a cold room. If you concentrate the fire and spread the iron, you get a warm room. You didn't say that before. You weren't ready to hear it before. You were still trying to survive. Now you're trying to understand. The distinction mattered. Ragna heard it the way she had heard her father's lesson about stored heat, not as information, but as a shift in how she saw the system. She was no longer building an emergency measure. She was learning a craft.
They tested each change methodically. Aslak had a process. Adjust one thing, fire the hearth, measure the result with his hands, adjust again. He made Ragna do the measuring, standing at different points in the box with her palms open, reporting what she felt. Warmer here, cooler there. A dead spot behind the second anvil where the air pooled cold and still. Dead spots mean the heat can't reach, Aslak said. Either the iron is blocking it or the air isn't moving. Open a gap. Let the convection carry the warmth around the obstacle. She opened a gap between the second and third anvil, widening it by 2 inches. The dead spot vanished. The warmth circulated into the corner where Eli's sleeping pallet lay. There, Aslak said. That gap is worth more than another 50 pounds of iron. People think more mass is always better. Sometimes the right gap matters more than the right weight. One evening, after a long day of repositioning masses and testing different arrangements, Aslak sat on the trunk and told her about his own apprenticeship. He had been 14 when he entered a smithy in Hallingdal, back in Norway. The master was a man named Herbrand, who had hands like shovels and a voice like gravel sliding down a tin roof. And he had taught Aslak by making him do everything wrong first. He'd tell me to heat a bar and I'd heat it too fast, and he'd say, "Feel it. Feel how the outside is hot and the inside is cold. A bar heated fast lies to you. It looks ready, but the core is still stubborn." Aslak flexed his bad leg, easing the stiffness. Everything I know about iron, I learned by getting it wrong, and then listening to the man who told me what wrong felt like. Is that why you came here? To tell me what wrong felt like? I came here because I heard something that didn't sound wrong. It sounded like the beginning of right. He paused. Your father, he understood this. Not the smithing, maybe, but the principle. That iron is honest. It takes what you give it and gives it back in its own time. No tricks, no shortcuts. Ragna looked at the hearth, at the dark curve of iron in the dim light, at the coal bed glowing faintly beneath the baffle. He used to say flame is quick, iron remembers. That's the whole trade in 6 words. They sat in silence for a while. The fire ticked. The iron breathed its stored warmth into the box. Outside, the wind moved across the plain without violence, steady and cold and endless. Aslak came 4 more times through the winter. Each visit brought new knowledge. They built an iron-backed bake hearth near the barn wall, a flat slab of salvaged plate propped against stone, designed to hold heat for bread baking long after the fire dropped. They experimented with a sleeping alcove, a narrow box framed with boards and lined with iron scraps on 3 sides, so a person lying inside was surrounded by radiating surfaces. The alcove was Aslak's idea. He built it for Eli. The boy's lungs need warm air through the night, he said. Not hot, warm, steady. He fitted the iron scraps with the care of a cabinet maker, checking each piece for sharp edges, filing where necessary with a rasp he had brought from home. If you charge the alcove iron from the hearth, carry heated pieces with the tongs and set them in place, the box stays warm for hours without any fire inside it. It worked. That night, Eli slept 6 unbroken hours for the first time since autumn. His breathing steadied in the warm air. His color improved. In the morning, he coughed less, and the cough sounded higher, looser, not the deep drowning sound of lungs losing a fight, but the lighter sound of lungs beginning to clear. Ragna stood in the barn doorway and watched the morning light cross the snow and felt something she had not felt in months. Not relief. Relief was too simple a word. It was the sensation of a weight shifting, moving from her shoulders to the ground, still present, but no longer crushing. But Aslak also clashed with her. It happened over the fireplace throat. Ragna wanted to narrow it further, close the opening until only a thin channel remained, forcing even more heat back into the room. Aslak refused. You narrow that throat anymore, and you'll get blowback in every crosswind, smoke in the room, carbon sickness. The boy's lungs can't take that. The throat is too wide. We're still losing half our heat up the chimney. You'll always lose heat up the chimney. That's what chimneys do. Your job is not to stop it. Your job is to steal enough of it on the way up to keep people alive. He pointed at the baffle. That steals some. The iron steals more. But the chimney has to breathe or the fire dies. And a dead fire in a sealed room is worse than a cold room with a working draft. How much worse? Dead worse. The kind of worse you don't wake up from. She heard the weight in his voice and understood that he was not being cautious. He was being specific. He had seen it, or known someone who had. A sealed room, a smothered fire, and a family that never woke. She left the throat where it was. The last time Aslak came was in April, when the snow was pulling back from the southern slopes, and the first mud of spring made the roads nearly impassable. His wagon got stuck twice on the 12-mile drive, and when he arrived, his bad leg was swollen, and his face was gray with pain. He stayed 2 days. They built a reflector wall of stacked iron behind the back hearth. His design, her labor, and he showed her how to check iron for fatigue cracking by running a wetted finger across the surface and listening for the hiss pattern. On the second evening, he gave her his tongs. Not lent, gave. I won't need them for the heavy work anymore, he said. The words came out flat, without sentiment, the way a man states a fact about weather or distance. But Ragna heard what was underneath. Your leg. My everything. I'm 66. The cold gets into the joints and doesn't leave. The wagon ride here was worse this time. Next winter it'll be worse again. Then I'll come to you. He looked at her with an expression she could not read. Then he shook his head. You'll be needed here. People will come to you, not the other way around. That's what happens when you know something other people need. He reached into his coat and pulled out a straight edge, the same one he had used to check her iron spacing. Take this too. Check your work. Check other people's work. If the spacing is wrong, the heat goes wrong, and someone gets hurt. Ragna took the straight edge. It was warm from his coat, from his body heat, and the warmth in her hand felt like something being passed that was larger than a tool. Watch where the heat goes, Aslak said. That's the whole lesson. Everything else is details. He had said it before. Hearing it again, she understood it differently. The first time it had been instruction. Now it was farewell. He left the next morning. His wagon creaked down the softening road, and Ragna watched until the sound faded and the plain swallowed the shape of him. She never saw him again. He died in September when a wagon axle he was repairing slipped its jack and pinned his bad leg. The injury festered. His daughters nursed him for 3 weeks, and he died in his own bed with his tools hung on the wall
and the autumn light coming through a window that faced west. Ragna learned of it from a freight driver passing through. She stood in the barn doorway and held the tongs in both hands and did not cry, because the tears she had were not the right shape for what she felt. What she felt was not grief alone, but the particular weight of a debt that could never be repaid to the person who held it, only forward, to the next person who needed what Aslak had given her. She went back inside and fired the hearth. She charged the iron the way he had taught her, concentrated, steady, watching the coals rather than the flames. She checked the spacing with his straight edge. She tapped a suspect block with his tongs and listened for the ring. The tools worked the same as they had when his hands held them. The knowledge was the same, only the hands had changed. The fire burned low that night. The iron gave its heat to the dark room in the slow, steady way it always did. And in the silence after the flames dropped, she heard the ticking of cooling metal, the same sound she had heard in her father's shop, the same sound Aslak had taught her to listen for, and it sounded like a language she was only beginning to learn. The secondary crisis came in November with the first hard freeze of the new winter. It was not a blizzard. It was worse in one respect. It was cold without wind, which meant it came quietly, without warning, dropping temperatures in the night while the sky stayed clear and the stars burned sharp and white overhead. 3 families woke to frozen water buckets and children shivering under every blanket they owned. 2 calves died at the Peterson place. The wheat farmer's stove, already cracked, had been patched with clay that failed in the cold, and the heat bled out through the seam like blood from a wound. His wife sent their oldest daughter running through the pre-dawn dark to Ragna's barn. The girl arrived breathless and terrified. "My father says the stove is dying and the babies are cold and he doesn't know what to do." Ragna was already dressed. She had felt the temperature drop through the floor of the barn and had fired the iron mass before midnight, charging it hard. Now she made a decision that would have been impossible a year ago. She organized. She sent Eli, stronger now, his lungs improved by months of warm sleeping, to Marta's house with instructions. Bring every piece of spare iron Marta could carry. Flat irons, Dutch ovens, the chain, anything dense and heavy. Bring them to Peterson's cabin. She loaded her own wagon, the one she had acquired in trade for teaching a farmer's wife the charging method, with heated iron blocks wrapped in canvas. Pieces she pulled from the edges of her own hearth mass, still radiating from the night's firing. She drove to Peterson's place through dark cold that bit at her face and hands. The cabin was frigid. The stove had not fully failed, but the cracked seam bled heat faster than the remaining fuel could replace it. Peterson's wife held the youngest child against her chest under a blanket. The other children huddled near the stove, close enough to feel the diminished warmth, far enough to see their own breath. Ragna did not lecture. She worked. She stacked the heated blocks against the outside of the stove, pressing them close to the iron body where they would absorb residual heat and radiate it outward. She took Marta's flat irons. Marta arrived 20 minutes later, red-faced and furious with the cold, and placed them in a semicircle on the floor around the stove, creating a secondary ring of thermal mass. She packed the cracked seam with a paste of wet ash and clay that would harden in the heat and slow the leak. Then she did something Aslak would have recognized. She crouched beside Peterson's wife and took her hand and held it near the iron, 6 inches from the surface of a heated block. "Feel that?" Ragna said. The woman felt it. The slow pulse. The heat that was not fire, but the memory of fire. When the stove drops, that block keeps giving. Your job is to charge it. Burn hard for an hour. Let the iron soak. Then when the fire falls, the iron carries you." "For how long?" "Long enough to rest. Long enough for the children to sleep without shaking. Not forever, but long enough." She straightened and turned to Peterson.
Burn everything you have. Don't ration. Burn it hard for 1 hour. Charge the iron, then bank the fire and let the iron carry you through. For how long? Long enough to get to morning. In the morning, cut more fuel, but tonight the iron buys you time. If this story reminds you why preparation matters more than luck, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Peterson burned everything he had. Within an hour, the iron mass around and against the stove was warm to the touch. The cabin's temperature climbed from dangerous to uncomfortable to survivable. The children stopped shivering. The youngest child fell asleep against her mother's chest. Marta stayed through the night, helping tend the fire. Ragnar moved on to the second family, the Holmes, the farrier and his wife, where the situation was less dire, but the principle was the same. She carried iron. She placed it. She taught. By dawn, she had visited 3 households. In each one, she left heated iron and instructions. In each one, she crouched beside the fire and showed someone how to feel for the heat coming off the metal surface, the slow, steady pulse that outlasted the flames. Aslak was gone. His tongs were in her hands. His straight edge was in her pocket. His words were in her mouth, though she changed them to fit her own voice. Feel where the heat goes. That tells you everything you need to know. When she returned to her own barn at mid-morning, the fire was nearly out, and the iron mass was cool. She had given away her heated blocks. She had spent her own reserves to save other people's children. Eli had kept the barn alive. He had fired the hearth himself, alone, at intervals through the night, using the charging method he had watched her perform 100 times. The box was warm. The cow was alive. The great anvil sat in the hearth mouth, doing what it always did, remembering what the fire had given it. "You taught me," Eli said. He was not boasting. He was stating a fact the way Aslak would have stated it, flat, honest, without ornament. "Your grandfather taught me," Ragnar said. "Same thing." She looked at her brother. He was taller than he had been in autumn. His face had lost the hollow look of malnutrition and chronic illness. His lungs still caught in the deep cold, but the coughing fits were shorter, shallower, less frightening. He was not the same boy who had stepped off the wagon a year ago with wet breath and old eyes. Neither was she the same woman. Creel's response to the secondary crisis was not conversion. It was commerce. Within a week of the freeze, he began selling what he called heat walls. Slabs of scrap iron crudely lashed to wooden frames, advertised at the roadhouse as the answer to winter heating. He priced them at $4 each, which was robbery for unfinished iron bolted to pine, and he sold 6 in the first 3 days to families desperate enough to pay anything that promised warmth. The first one collapsed within a week. The iron slabs, improperly braced, shifted in the heat and toppled sideways, scattering hot metal across a dirt floor. A child had been sitting 3 feet away. The mother pulled the child back in time, an inch closer, a second slower, and the story would have ended differently. No one was injured, but the family's trust in the iron, in the principle, in Creel, shattered. They dismantled the heat wall the same night and stacked the iron outside in the snow, as if the metal itself were to blame. Creel blamed the principle. He told anyone who would listen that iron near fire was inherently dangerous, that the whole method was the delusion of a girl who had gotten lucky in one storm, and that the families who had bought his heat walls should demand their money back from Ragnar, not from him. He repeated it at the supply window, at the livery, at the roadhouse bar where men gathered in the evenings. The repetition was calculated. He understood that a lie told often enough became indistinguishable from a concern. The accusation was absurd but effective. It muddied the difference between careful construction and careless profiteering.
People who had been curious about the iron method heard about the collapsed heat wall and hesitated. A woman who had planned to bring her husband's brake shoes inside for the winter stacking method decided to wait. A farmer who had been collecting scrap iron left the pieces in his shed. Ragna heard about it from Marta, who arrived at the barn with anger in every step. "He's ruining it," Marta said. "He's taken what you built and turning it into a thing people are afraid of." Then we show them the difference. How? We invite them here. We let them see. We let them feel. Ragna held an open demonstration that Saturday. 7 families came, some curious, some skeptical, some dragged by wives who had already felt the iron's warmth and wanted their husbands to understand. She walked them through the barn, the hearth, the iron mass, the partition, the alcove. She let them put their hands near the iron. She let them feel the difference between charged iron and dead iron, between a sealed box and an open room, between a baffle-slowed draft and a chimney running wild. Then she did something none of them expected. She let the fire die completely. She let them stand in the box with no flames, no coals, nothing but the dark mass of iron radiating the heat it had stored from the morning's firing. The room cooled, but it cooled slowly, not the sudden crash of warmth that happened when a stove fire went out in a leaking cabin, but a gradual easing, like a held breath being released. "This is what the iron gives you," she said. "Time, not heat forever. Time between fires. Time to sleep. Time for your children to stop shaking." A woman named Birgit, married to a cattle rancher who had not come, stood with tears on her face. Her youngest had been one of the children in Peterson's cabin during the freeze. She did not speak. She did not need to. Ragna showed them what Creel's heat wall lacked: spacing for air circulation, a stable base, proper placement relative to the fire, and the understanding that iron near flame was not a product to be sold, but a method to be learned. She showed them the difference between iron bolted to a plank, Creel's version, and iron set on a proper foundation with room to breathe and expand, and throw its heat where people lived. The farrier Holm, the man who had stayed silent during Creel's mockery at the supply window, spoke up. "It's the same as shoeing. You don't just heat the iron. You heat it right, you place it right, and you check it after. Anything less, and someone gets hurt." 7 families left with knowledge. Within a month, 4 of them had adapted some version of the retained heat method: iron stacked near stoves, chains wrapped around pipes, Dutch ovens placed against firebox walls, sleeping corners partitioned and sealed. None of it was Ragna's exact system. All of it worked on the same principle. The iron remembered. And now the settlement was beginning to remember too. But Creel was not finished. And the question of what Ragna Tveit's life would become, provider, teacher, exile, or something none of them had words for yet, remained open in a way that the winter, for all its cruelty, had not resolved. By the second winter, the barn was no longer a place people pitied. It was a place people came to. They came singly and in pairs, on horseback and on foot, in wagons loaded with scrap iron and questions. A rancher's wife from 8 miles north who had heard about the freeze and wanted to see the alcove. A circuit preacher who warmed his hands near the great anvil and said it was the most Christian use of a blacksmith's tools he had ever witnessed. A freighter who had spent 3 decades on the plains and had never considered that the iron he hauled might serve a purpose beyond what it was shaped for. Ragna received them all. She did not charge. She did not turn anyone away. She showed them the system the way Aslak had shown her, through touch, through demonstration, through the patient repetition of a principle that was simple enough for a child to feel and complex enough that grown men argued about it over supper. A typical visit lasted an hour. Ragna would fire the hearth with the visitor watching, building the burn tight and concentrated against the iron mass. She would let them feel the difference between the radiant heat from the iron and the convective heat from the flames, one steady and directional, the other chaotic and easily stolen by the draft. She would let the fire die and make them wait, hands near the metal, feeling the slow release that continued long after the last coal went dark. Most people resisted at first. Not the idea, the patience. They wanted to see flame. They wanted the comfort of watching fire do its work. The idea that the real work happened after the fire dropped, in the silent hours when iron breathed its stored heat into the room, required a shift in thinking that did not come naturally to people raised on the frontier's equation of more fire equals more warmth. "Stop looking at the flame," Ragna would say, echoing Aslak so closely that sometimes she startled herself. The flame is not what saves you. The flame is what charges the iron. The iron is what saves you. Some visitors understood immediately. A woman named Birgit, whose youngest had nearly frozen at Peterson's cabin during the November crisis, knelt beside the hearth and held her palms open and felt the slow pulse of stored heat, and said nothing for a full minute. When she stood, her eyes were wet, and she asked only one question. "How much iron do I need for a room 12 by 14? Others argued. A cattle rancher from the north said he had been burning wood his whole life and his father before him, and the notion that a pile of metal could replace good fuel was the kind of thinking that got people killed. Ragna did not argue back. She let him stand in the box after the fire died and feel the temperature hold. She let him stand outside the box in the unheated barn and feel the cold press in. She let the iron do the arguing. He came back a week later with a wagon load of brake shoes and axle stubs and asked her to show him where to put them. Then she would walk them through the adaptation for their own situation. Not every household had anvils. Most did not. But every household had iron of some kind, stove parts, wheel rims, plow blades, kettles, chains, horseshoes, brake shoes, axle stubs. The principle did not require a specific form. It required mass, placement, and the understanding that heat stored in dense material outlasted heat stored in air. She drew diagrams on barnboard with charcoal. She made lists of what to look for in scrap: dense, uniform, no voids. She taught people to tap iron and listen for the ring the way Aslak had taught her. She taught them to check placement with a straight edge and to feel for dead spots and to open gaps where the air needed to circulate. The children learned fastest. They had not yet decided what was possible and what was not, and the idea that a piece of iron could remember fire struck them as wonderful rather than strange. Ragna let them handle small pieces, horseshoes warmed at safe distances, flat scraps heated in the sun, and feel the difference between iron warmth and wood warmth and stone warmth. The lessons looked like play. They were the beginning of knowledge. Eli became her assistant. At 13, he was strong enough to move the smaller pieces and patient enough to explain the principle to visitors who struggled with it. He had a gift for simplification that Ragna lacked, where she described physics. He described results. Put the iron near the hot part. Wait. Feel it later. That's all it is. The visitors nodded at Eli's version and then asked Ragna for the details. By spring, 11 households within a day's ride had adopted some version of the retained heat method. Not all used it well. Not all maintained the spacing or the charging cycle or the draft management that made the difference between a warm room and a dangerous experiment. Ragna visited when she could. She corrected what she found. She taught the correction the same way she taught the method, hands on the iron, feeling for the truth. Creel's final reckoning came not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a slow, humiliating erosion of the ground he stood on. Through the second winter, he continued to disparage the method. He told customers at the roadhouse that the iron trick was a novelty that would fade when people realized how much labor it required. He pointed to his own failed heat walls as evidence that the principle was flawed, ignoring or pretending to ignore that his walls had failed because of his construction, not the physics. But the evidence was accumulating against him. Family after family reported warmer nights, less fuel consumed, fewer mornings waking to frozen water buckets. The Petersons patched their stove seam and stacked wheel rims against the firebox, and reported that their fuel consumption dropped by what they estimated was a third. Marta wrapped chain around her stovepipe and packed flat irons against the stove body, and told her husband when he finally came home that if he touched her iron arrangement, she would put him out in the snow. The Ferrier home began offering to assess households for retained heat potential, walking kitchens and barns the way Ragna had walked them, tapping iron, checking draft, recommending placement. He did not charge for the assessment. He charged for the ironwork, modifications, brackets, custom-cut plates that the assessment recommended. It was fair business built on sound knowledge, and it undercut Creel's salvage trade by giving scrap iron a value Creel had not anticipated. Creel felt the shift. His roadhouse still operated. His salvage trade still functioned. But the iron he had expected to buy cheap from the dead blacksmith's claim, the iron Ragna had dragged into a fireplace and turned into a heating system, was now worth more in place than it would ever have been in his yard. And the woman he had dismissed as a fool was now the person settlers consulted before they consulted him. The final moment came in the February of the third winter. A cold snap, not a blizzard, but a sustained, grinding freeze that lasted 9 days, pushed temperatures across the region into the range where stove seams cracked and water froze in kettles and livestock died standing in their stalls. Creel's roadhouse had a stove. It was a good stove, heavy cast iron, well maintained. But the building was large and drafty, built for traffic, not for insulation, and the stove's single firebox could not keep the common room above freezing when the cold pressed this hard for this long. On the 5th day of the freeze, a seam in the stove's flue pipe opened, not a crack, a separation. Heat bled from the pipe into the roof space instead of radiating into the room. The common room temperature dropped overnight to a point where the water barrel inside the door froze solid. Creel tried to fix it himself. He packed the seam with wet rags that dried and shrank within an hour. He wrapped wire around the joint that held for one firing and then slipped when the metal expanded. He burned more fuel, pushing the stove harder, which only widened the separation. Each attempt cost him wood, time, and the particular agony of a competent man discovering the limits of his competence. On the 6th morning, a freight team arrived at the roadhouse, and the driver refused to unharness inside. The common room was colder than the barn. 2 other drivers, stranded by the freeze, had already moved their bedrolls to the stable, where animal heat kept the air above freezing. Creel's business, the business that depended on the roadhouse being a place where men could warm up, eat, and sleep, was dying with his stovepipe. He had 2 choices. He could close the roadhouse and lose the freight business that depended on it staying open through winter, or he could ask for help from the one person he had spent 2 years disparaging. He came to Ragna's barn on the 6th day. He did not come humbly. Humility was not in his vocabulary. He came with the rigid posture of a man performing an act he found distasteful but necessary, the way a man goes to a doctor he dislikes because the pain has become unbearable. "I need iron placed," he said from the doorway. He did not step inside. "Around the stove. The way you do it." Ragna was sorting scrap, a new load she had acquired from a settler moving east who had no use for the iron he could not carry. She did not look up. "Your stovepipe is separated," she said. "I heard. Can you fix it or not? I can show you how to supplement the heat while the pipe is repaired.
The fix is ironwork. Holm can do the pipe. I'm not asking Holm, I'm asking you. She set down the piece she was holding and looked at him. He stood in the doorway the way he had stood 2 years ago when he told her she would crack the hearth and smoke herself dead. The same posture, the same coat. But the expression underneath was different. The certainty was gone. What remained was the particular discomfort of a man who had been wrong for a long time and had run out of room to pretend otherwise. I'll come tomorrow, Ragnar said. Today. Tomorrow. The iron needs to be selected and heated. Bring me the dimensions of your stove and the distance from the firebox to the nearest wall. I'll bring what you need. He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he nodded once, turned, and left. She went the next day. She brought 6 heavy blocks, preheated in her own hearth and wrapped in canvas to hold their charge. She placed them around Creel's stove in the pattern she had refined over 2 years, close to the firebox, spaced for circulation, angled to throw heat into the room. She packed the flue separation with her ash and clay paste as a temporary seal. She hung a chain around the undamaged section of pipe to capture what heat still radiated from it. Creel watched from across the room. He did not help. He did not comment. When she finished, the common room was warmer than it had been in 5 days. Charge these every morning, she said. Hard burn for an hour. Let them soak. They'll carry you until the pipe is fixed. He said nothing. The iron is on loan, she added. I'll collect it when you're done. She left. Behind her, the roadhouse common room held its heat for the first time in nearly a week, and Silas Creel stood in the warmth of iron he had once told her would crack a hearth and kill a family. He never thanked her. He never acknowledged that the method worked. But he never spoke against it again. And in the spring, when she sent Eli to collect the iron blocks, Creel returned them cleaned and oiled with a sack of coffee beans set on top that neither of them ever mentioned. It was not friendship. It was not even respect in any form Creel would have recognized. It was the grudging, silent acknowledgement of a man whose world had shifted beneath him and who had chosen, at last, to stop fighting the ground. Jonas Hale arrived in the 3rd spring, and he arrived with a hammer in his belt and sawdust in his hair, and the quiet manner of a man who had learned that silence was more useful than speech. He was 31, a widower, a carpenter by trade, with hands that knew wood the way Ragnar's knew iron. His wife had died of typhus 2 years earlier in a settlement 60 miles west, and he had come east looking for work and distance from the place where she had died. He found both at the Peterson farm, where he was hired to frame a new room addition. He met Ragnar because Peterson's wife asked her to advise on the heating arrangement for the new room. Ragnar came. Jonas was on the roof, fitting rafters. She was inside, studying the stove placement and sketching iron positions on the new floor. Their first conversation was about a wall. If you frame the interior partition with a double layer, Ragnar said, looking up at the skeleton of the new room, you can pack straw between them. It'll hold heat better than a single board. Jonas looked down from the rafter. I know how to insulate a wall. Then why is this one single-layered? He climbed down. He looked at the partition. He looked at her. She was covered in charcoal dust from the floor sketching, her hair tied back with a strip of leather, Aslak's tongs hanging from her belt like a sidearm. Because Peterson is paying for one layer, he said. Then I'll pay for the second. Out of the straw I have. The room won't hold heat without it. And if the room won't hold heat, the iron I place is wasted. He studied her for a moment. Not the way men usually studied her, not with dismissal or amusement or the careful appraisal of a woman's usefulness. He studied her the way a craftsman studies another craftsman's work. He was looking at the charcoal diagram on the floor, reading it, understanding what it described. You've done this before, he said, for 2 years. The iron in the fireplace, I heard about it. Everyone heard about it. I heard it works. It works, he nodded. Then he turned back to the rafter he was fitting and said without looking at her, I'll frame the double wall. Tell Peterson it was my idea. He'll argue less with a man." She almost laughed. Almost. The honesty of it, the plain acknowledgement that the frontier's rules about whose ideas mattered were stupid but real, landed somewhere between insult and alliance. They worked on the Peterson edition for 3 weeks. During that time, they spoke mostly about materials. Which woods held heat, which leaked it, how tight a joint needed to be before it stopped drafts, where iron should sit relative to a stove in a properly insulated room versus a leaking one. The conversations were technical, practical, and entirely free of the performances that usually accompanied a man and a woman talking on the frontier. On the 4th day, Jonas made a mistake. He framed a window opening on the north wall, the wall that would take the brunt of winter wind. Ragna looked at it and said nothing for a moment. "You'll lose half the room's heat through that window," she said. "Peterson wants light on that side." "Then build it small and double pane it. Use 2 layers of glass with a sealed air gap. Air trapped between glass holds heat better than a single pane." Jonas looked at her. He had built windows for 15 years. No one had ever told him to double pane one. He thought about it for 10 seconds, then nodded. "That'll cost more glass. It'll save more wood." He rebuilt the window with a double layer. Peterson's wife, watching from the doorway, said it was the first time she had seen a carpenter take instruction from a woman without turning red. Jonas heard her and kept working. He did not turn red because the instruction was correct, and he had spent enough years around incorrect people to recognize the difference. On the 12th day, a rainstorm trapped them both inside the half-finished addition. They sat on opposite sawhorses, with the rain drumming on the temporary roof, and talked about something other than materials for the first time. Jonas told her about his wife, not the death, but the life before it, how she had planted a garden in soil so poor that nothing should have grown, and how the garden had produced tomatoes anyway, and how she had said the tomatoes tasted better because the soil had fought them. Ragna told him about her father, not the lesson about iron. He had already heard that from half the settlement. She told him about the way her father whistled while he worked, a tuneless sound that meant he was thinking, and how the whistling stopped when he found the problem and started again when he found the answer. "My wife hummed," Jonas said. "Same thing." They sat in the rain and did not say anything else for a while, and the silence between them was the kind that does not need to be filled. On the last day of the job, Jonas came to Ragna's barn to return a trowel she had lent him. He stood in the box and looked at the iron hearth, the great anvil, the semicircle, the baffle, the alcove, and he was quiet for a long time. "You built this," he said, "with help. But you saw it first, before anyone helped. You saw what the iron could do." "My father saw it. I just remembered." He set the trowel on the trunk. "I'm going to be working at the home place next. After that, I don't have a contract." "There's work here," Ragna said. "The barn needs a proper door. The 4th wall needs reframing. And I want to build an inner room framed, insulated, with iron placed in the walls." "Iron in the walls?" "Flat plates, set between double-layered boards. The stove heats them through the interior surface. The iron holds it. The room stays warm longer." Jonas looked at the walls. He looked at the iron. He looked at Ragna. "I'll start after the home job," he said. He started after the home job. He did not leave. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened through shared labor. They built the inner room together, Jonas framing, Ragna placing iron, both of them arguing about spacing and insulation and draft lines with the comfortable intensity of 2 people who cared more about getting it right than about being right. He learned to feel for iron warmth the way she did. She learned to read wood grain the way he did. The overlap between their knowledge created something neither had possessed alone, a complete understanding of how a shelter could be built to hold heat, from the frame to the fire to the iron that remembered. They married the following autumn in the barn, with Marta and Peterson's family and the farrier Holm and Eli as witnesses. The ceremony was brief. The meal afterward was long.
Someone had brought a fiddle, and the sound of it in the barn, mixed with the tick of cooling iron from the evening's charge, was the closest thing to music Ragna had heard in 3 years. The years compressed the way frontier years did, not evenly, but in clusters of effort and stillness. The barn became a workshop. Jonas built proper walls, a proper door, a loft for storage. Ragna expanded the hearth system twice, adding mass as she acquired it, refining the spacing and the baffle placement with each addition. The sleeping alcove became a permanent feature, iron-lined, insulated, warm enough for the children who came. 2 children. A girl named Sigri, born the first winter of the marriage, who learned to walk by pulling herself up on the base of the great anvil. A boy named Petter, born 2 years later, who was fascinated by fire and had to be watched near the hearth with the constant vigilance of parents who understood what heat could do. Sigri grew up with iron in her hands the way other girls grew up with needles or dough. At 6, she could identify cast iron from wrought by sound. The cast rang higher, brighter. At 10, she could assess a stove's heat retention by touching the wall behind it and measuring the warmth that bled through. She had her mother's patience for teaching and her father's skill with tools, and by 15 she was walking households alongside Rana, the 2 of them moving through kitchens and sleeping rooms with the synchronized efficiency of people who shared a language no one else entirely spoke. Peter was different. He had Jonas's quietness and Ragna's stubbornness, a combination that made him difficult at close range and invaluable at distance. He left the settlement at 17 to work on railroad construction, and he carried with him a knowledge of materials and heat that surfaced in unexpected places, insulating a bunkhouse, banking a cook fire so it lasted through a 12-hour shift, advising a foreman that the iron plates stacked near the camp stove were not decoration, but infrastructure. He never came home to stay, but he wrote letters that arrived seasonally, and in each one, somewhere between the news and the weather, there was a detail about heat or iron, or the way cold moved through a badly built room that told Ragna he had been paying attention all along. Eli grew into a young man who carried the method in his bones. At 16, he could assess a cabin's heating potential in 10 minutes, walking the room, tapping iron, checking draft, feeling for dead spots. At 18, he left to work as a hired hand on a cattle operation 40 miles west, and within a year the ranch house had iron stacked around every stove and a sleeping alcove in the bunkhouse that the cowboys pretended to mock and secretly fought over on cold nights. He married at 24, a woman named Christy from a settlement family who understood retained heat the way she understood bread rising, as a fact of life rather than an innovation. Their first child was born in a room with iron in the walls. Ragna taught through the years the way water shapes stone, not in single dramatic events, but in the steady, repeated application of pressure. She showed farm wives and ranchers and their children. She showed circuit riders and freight drivers, and a school teacher from the East who wrote an article about frontier heating that was published in a territorial newspaper and read, presumably, by people who had never felt iron warmth in their lives. She did not become famous. She became known. There is a difference. Famous is what happens when a story reaches people who will never meet you. Known is what happens when the people who live near you understand what you can do and come to you when they need it. Ragna was known within a radius of perhaps 30 miles, the distance a wagon could travel in a day, and within that radius, her name meant something specific, the woman who understood how heat stayed. The settlement changed around her. Frame houses replaced soddies. Manufactured stoves replaced hearth cooking. The railroad came closer, and with it came coal at prices that made wood gathering less desperate. But the principle she had taught did not become irrelevant with progress. If anything, it became more useful. A manufactured stove surrounded by iron mass held its heat longer than a stove standing alone. A properly insulated room with iron in the walls
needed less coal than a room with single board framing. The method adapted to every improvement because it was not a technique bound to one kind of shelter. It was an understanding of how heat moved through matter, and that understanding applied whether the matter was a ruined barn or a new-built house. Some years were harder than others. The winter of 1893 brought a financial panic that reached even the plains, and families who had been comfortable found themselves rationing coal and cutting green wood. Ragna and Jonas took in 2 families during the worst of it, housing them in the barn's expanded sleeping quarters, where the iron mass kept the space livable on less fuel than a standalone cabin would have required. It was the first blizzard winter all over again, except this time the system was mature, the iron was properly placed, and the woman tending it was not a terrified girl, but a provider who understood exactly what the metal could and could not do. Each autumn, before the first hard freeze, she walked the properties of anyone who asked. She checked iron placement, she tested draft, she corrected what had shifted or degraded over the summer. She carried Aslak's straight edge in her coat pocket and his tongs on her belt. And when she tapped iron and listened for the ring, she heard his voice in the sound, not as memory, but as method. The knowledge had passed through him and into her hands, and from her hands into the hands of others, and from them it would pass again, each time changed slightly, but never losing the core truth that a dead smith in Norway had taught a boy named Aslak, who had taught a girl named Ragna, who had taught anyone willing to kneel beside a fire and feel where the heat went. Jonas built alongside her for 23 years. He framed houses and barns across the settlement with double walls and iron placement built into the design. He never claimed the method. He never needed to. His work spoke for itself. Tight joints, sound frames, rooms that held their warmth the way a good barrel held water. He died in the winter of 1911, quietly, in the inner room they had built together, with the iron still warm in the walls and the fire still burning in the hearth. Ragna lived another 7 years after that. Her hands slowed, her eyes dimmed, but each autumn she still walked a room and felt for drafts before she commented on firewood. She still pressed her palm near the iron and waited for the warmth to reach her skin. She still listened for the tick of cooling metal in the silence after the fire dropped. When visitors came, and they still came, even in her last years, she showed them the same thing she had always shown them. Not a system, not an invention, a principle. Feel that, she would say, her hand near the iron, her voice carrying the echo of every person who had said those words to her. The fire's been down an hour. The air's cold already, but the iron remembers. Within 5 winters of that first blizzard, 14 households across the eastern stretch of the settlement had adopted some form of retained heat practice. Iron-backed hearths, chain-wrapped stovepipes, scrap metal radiators, insulated sleeping alcoves. The variations were as different as the families who built them, but the principle was the same. Heat stored in dense mass outlasted heat stored in thin air. That understanding passed from hand to hand by a woman who had learned it from a wheelwright, who had learned it from a master smith in a valley across the sea, changed how a small piece of the northern plains survived its winters. Ragna Tveit. Paule died in the spring of 1918 in the inner room of the barn she had first entered as a desperate girl with $27 and a sick brother. She was 52. Her hands were scarred from 3 decades of iron work. Aslak's tongs hung on the wall above the hearth, blackened and worn, and beside them hung the straight edge, still true. The great anvil sat in the firebox where she had placed it 31 years before, its face smoothed by decades of thermal cycling, its horn chipped and dark. It was warm when she died. The fire had been down for hours, but the iron was still warm. On the night she died,
The wind came from the northwest the way it had in that first blizzard, hard and flat across the plain, driving cold before it like a hand pushing through a door. Harlan Voss was long dead by then, but his words lived in the memory of everyone who had heard them. You haven't got a room. You've got a sieve. And they did have a sieve that first winter.
They had a leaking barn and a greedy chimney and a cord and a half of rotten wood and nothing that should have kept a woman and a boy alive through a Dakota storm. But inside the sieve, in the dark, the iron ring held its heat the way Ragna held her brother, not forever, but long enough. The fire burned low, the coals collapsed, and the anvils gave back what the flames had given them, hour after hour, through the longest night, until the room itself remembered warmth the way iron remembers fire, not as a thing possessed, but as a thing that passes through and leaves its mark.